Hi, my name is Anna Bushy, and I am a junior double majoring in English Literature and Global Studies and double minoring in Women's and Gender Studies and Environmental Studies. Today, I am excited to share with you my final paper from Environmental Ethics, which I took in the fall of 2020 with Dr. Tess Varner. This paper is titled Getting Back to the Right Nature, Understanding Wilderness's Relationship to Women and Moving Towards an Ecofeminist Ecological Self. In his seminal essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature, William Cronon claims that wilderness is not quite what it seems. Instead of conforming to the dominant society's conceptualization of wilderness as a, quote, pristine sanctuary where the last remnant of an untouched, endangered, but still transcendent nature can for at least a little while longer be untainted by civilization, Cronon argues that wilderness is a product of civilization and it therefore reflects our own unexamined longings and desires. In other words, Cronon understands the idea of wilderness as a complex cultural construction psychologically born of the very stuff that civilization has repressed, which I would add is comprised not only of ideologies influenced by 19th century cultural trends in Romanticism, like the sublime, and American patriotism, like the frontier, as Cronon maintains, but the patriarchal norms dictating how women are treated within patriarchal societies. While I do not disagree with the thesis that Cronon presents in his work, the goal of my argument is to address how patriarchal norms have shaped the treatment of women in wilderness through a logic of domination, which has resulted in a connection between patriarchal societies' relationship with women and their relationship with culturally constructed wilderness. After identifying the presence of these domineering attitudes within our quotidian understandings of how we are related to women in wilderness, I will discuss how we can begin to reconcile our master identity complex by adopting what Greta Gard calls an ecofeminist ecological self. When one recognizes how wilderness and women are conceptually related to one another and identifies how patriarchal societies' relationships with each are similar, cultivating an ecofeminist ecological self may provide a foundation for getting back to the right nature as opposed to the wrong nature that Cronon references in the title of his aforementioned essay. First, in order to understand how wilderness and women are conceptually related to one another, it is important to explicate the ecofeminist foundations on which I will construct my argument upon. In this section of my presentation, I will focus my attention on ecofeminist teachings of two theoretical concepts that will be most relevant to my argument: the logic of domination and binary forms of thinking. The ways in which society perceives both women and wilderness are influenced by the logic of domination. In her explanation of this concept, Marion Hortequin cites Karen Warren, who defines the logic of domination as, quote, a structure of argumentation which leads to a justification of subordination, end quote. Such arguments, Hortequin clarifies, function by identifying binaries and marking one binary as superior over the other, which is made possible through a framework dictated by up-down thinking. Thus, quote, this superiority justifies the subordination of the inferior member of the pair, end quote. As one example, we can look to the nature-culture binary and female-male binary that assist in establishing a logic of domination over both women and nature. Traditional Western thought defines culture as that which is human or made by humans, and nature as that which is not human nor made by humans. An ecofeminist analysis of the nature-culture binary that emerges as a product of these definitions reveals that this binary typically works to elevate culture over nature, and one can take this analysis even further by observing the conceptual link between this nature-culture dualism and the female-male dualism, as Hortequin observes. Feminist and ecofeminist theories have documented the ways in which women have traditionally been perceived as being closer to nature, and men have traditionally been perceived as being closer to culture, which has been to the detriment of women living in patriarchal societies. The basic argument that prevails as a result of these particular perceptions, as explained by Catherine Roach, is that, quote, in patriarchal culture, when women are seen as closer to nature than men, women are inevitably seen as less fully human than men, due to men's association with culture or that which is made by humans, end quote. When viewed as subhuman, Roach explains that, quote, women are perceived to merge with nature, to be part of the non-human surroundings and only semi-human, end quote, And relatedly, quote, nature is perceived as female, as virgin resource to be exploited or raped, as sharing in women's semi-human quality, end quote. In other words, due to the dualistic associations presented by the nature-culture binary and the female-male binary, a logic of domination persists within cultural conceptions of women and nature, resulting in a connection to one another. Ecofeminist perspectives regarding the logic of domination and binaries assist us in understanding how the dominant culture has remained complicit in perpetuating the subordination of both women and nature. From here, we can begin to observe the connection between not only women and nature, but that between women and, more specifically, wilderness, as the ways in which patriarchal society has constructed their relationships with both remain eerily similar. Now that I have identified relevant ecofeminist frameworks and have explained how women and wilderness are conceptually associated with one another, I would like to dedicate this section of my presentation to the crux of my thesis by establishing the ways in which patriarchal societies' relationships with women and culturally constructed wilderness are connected to one another as a result of the patriarchal norms instituted by the logic of domination. Before I begin, however, I would like to note that while I will argue that a generalized connection between women and wilderness exists, it is important to note that there is more to a woman's identity, such as her race, class, sexuality, religion, ability, age, etc., that affects how poignantly this connection may manifest itself, as the logic of domination scope reaches far beyond the bounds of gender and non-human others such as wilderness. With that being said, it is also necessary for me to define what exactly I mean when I discuss the notion of wilderness. Wilderness, as defined in the Wilderness Act of 1964, is, quote, in contrast with those areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape, is an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. It is land which retains its primeval character and influence without permanent improvements or human habitation, which is protected and managed so as to preserve its natural condition, and which generally appears to have been affected primarily by forces of nature, with the imprint of man's work substantially unnoticeable, end quote. In this definition of wilderness, it is important to note that one of the defining characteristics of wilderness is the absence of humans. Linda Vance claims that, quote, in defining wilderness by the absence of humans, we are saying, in effect, that nature is at its best when utterly separated from the human world, end quote, which in turn makes the idea of wilderness, quote, an extreme manifestation of the general Western conceptual rift between culture and nature, end quote. Cronin stands by this sentiment in his explanation of wilderness as a cultural construct, and it even influences his conclusion that the ways in which wilderness is culturally constructed as a pristine sanctuary reveal that nature is in an ideological superior position to culture within the nature-culture binary. However, as mentioned in the previous section, ecofeminists like myself are concerned with how the nature-culture binary can be conceptually linked to the female-male binary. Such a connection, of course, takes notice of the ways in which nature and women are oppressed by the logic of domination inscribed into understandings of each within the dominant culture. As an entity related to what is signified by nature, wilderness can thus be understood as positioned within terms of this binary as well. Thus, as I will detail next, further work can be done to establish both the conceptual and social link between women and wilderness. The proof of a connection between patriarchal societies' relationships with women and wilderness can be explicated within an analysis of the logic of domination that subordinates each. This logic of domination, as I will suggest, takes shape in at least three forms that dictate how the dominant patriarchal culture ought to interact with and value both women and wilderness. It is within this logic of domination that the core of the relationship between women and wilderness is situated. First, both women and wilderness exist to serve their dualistic counterparts. Second, each exists within clearly marked boundaries between self and other, the latter of which they are pigeonholed into. And third, understandings of both are constructed by the male gaze. While I am sure that more interpretations of how the logic of domination shapes the conceptual relationship between women and wilderness exist, and I welcome any thoughts as to what those may be, I will be limiting my focus to just these three manifestations of it for the purposes of my argument here. The first interpretation of the link between women and wilderness that I suggest is in regards to how both women and wilderness exist to serve their respective dualistic counterparts, men and culture. As Vance reminds us, quote, wilderness exists not for itself, but for the recreational, scientific, life support, aesthetic, and spiritual needs of humans, end quote. In other words, wilderness has been constructed as existing to serve culture. Something similar can be said about women living in patriarchal society, as they are perceived by the dominant culture to exist not for themselves, but for men. The existence of women may be understood for purposes regarding reproduction, domesticity, both physical and emotional unpaid labor, and sexual aesthetics tailored to the male gaze. Commanding that women in wilderness ought to exist solely to serve something other than themselves is the first way in which women in wilderness are societally linked to one another through the logic of domination. My second point in relation to the connection between women and wilderness is that each has been othered by patriarchal society. According to Vance, quote, the idea of wilderness originates at least in part in ideologies of conquest and domination of nature and of clearly demarcated boundaries between self and other, end quote, with wilderness being subjugated as the other. Greta Gard has also claimed that wilderness is, quote, an other to the self of Western culture, end quote. Similarly, Marty Keel cites Simone de Beauvoir, who discusses how a woman's sense of self is entangled with her status as the other. Therefore, neither women nor wilderness are allowed selfhood as a result of the ways in which they have been effectively othered within a patriarchal society that aims to restrict their autonomy and agency, which generates the second way in which the logic of domination shapes patriarchal society's relationship with women in wilderness. Last, the connection between women and wilderness is further demonstrated within an analysis of how the male gaze shapes society's perceptions of each. Here, perhaps it may be most helpful to draw upon a phenomenon that has been popularized by scholars such as Jose Knighton and Lydia Millett, ecoporn. Such scholars, among numerous others, have illuminated how mainstream visual representations of wilderness, non-human animals, nature, etc., can bear a striking resemblance to pornographic images of women. Bart Welling claims that ecoporn can, quote, code the viewer's eyes not just in similar, but in deeply interrelated ways, end quote, to the viewer of pornography's eyes. He states that this happens, quote, as a solitary, central but remote, omniscient, all-powerful, potentially violent, pleasure-taking, commodifying, an all-seeing but simultaneously consuming male subject to a female object of completely opposite characteristics, end quote. The relationship between women and wilderness through a case study on pornography and ecoporn becomes especially pronounced within each's fetishization of untouchable, virgin landscapes, or women through a voyeuristic, controlling lens constructed by the male gaze. Thus, such renderings of the environment and women are perceived as justification for their objectification and instrumentalization of as subhuman others. Thus, by observing how the reproduction of the male gaze constructs women and wilderness through pornography and ecoporn, we can detect how the logic of domination yet again contributes to the creation of similar relationships between patriarchal society and women in wilderness. Now that I have explained patriarchal society's relationships with women in wilderness and how it is constructed through manifestations of the logic of domination, I would like to now focus my attention on how society can begin to reconcile the logic of domination that they participate in. Here, I will be drawing upon what Gard calls the ecofeminist ecological self. The ecofeminist ecological self, as Gard suggests, has the potential to heal patriarchal society's harmful relationships with wilderness and women. In remedying these relationships, there exists a possibility for initiating the dissolution of the logic of domination that oppresses both entities. In order to commence a positive transformation of Western culture's similar domineering relationships with wilderness and women, Gard explains that the ecofeminist ecological self can provide a solution, as, quote, it names our participation in both culture and in nature, thereby dismantling the human nature dualism through orienting oneself to wilderness, end quote, through a relational ethic. Even more, Gard describes how the ecofeminist ecological self will assist in, quote, reclaiming a crucial part of the self which has been projected onto the other, end quote. A claim reminiscent of Cronin's argument regarding the mirror that wilderness holds up to us to reflect our own unexamined longings and desires. Thus, by addressing how we have culturally constructed both wilderness and patriarchal relationships with women based on our own projections and desires, adopting an ecofeminist ecological self has the potential to heal our relationship with wilderness and women, both of whom, as addressed in an earlier section, are associated with nature, by subverting the human nature dualism that underpins the logic of domination responsible for oppressing both entities. In adopting and practicing Guard's suggestion, we can begin working towards the liberation of women in wilderness. As I've demonstrated throughout my argument, the similarities between patriarchal societies' relationships with women and culturally constructed wilderness becomes apparent through an ecofeminist lens. Patriarchal societies' relationships with women and wilderness are related through the ways in which the logic of domination similarly oppresses both entities, which, as I suggest, is characterized by how both exist to serve their dualistic counterparts, how both are othered within society, and how both have come to be understood through the production of the male gaze. It is within an adoption of Guard's ecofeminist ecological self that patriarchal societies can begin to reconcile their oppressive relationships with wilderness and women. The ecofeminist ecological self could perhaps assist us in getting back to the right nature, as opposed to the wrong nature that Cronin references in the title of his essay. Since the ecofeminist ecological self is rooted in cultivating an empathetic relational ethic, it provides the space for us to healthily interact with authentic versions of women in wilderness, not the far off, unrealistically perfect versions of them, as, according to Cronin, this is when we get into trouble. Here is my work cited. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and thank you to Dr. Varner for her endless support and mentorship. I look forward to seeing all of you at the Q&A. Thank you.